Welcome. I'm James Calicut, waterfowl and upland game bird extension specialist.
I'm Mark McConnell, Assistant Professor of Upland Birds at Mississippi State University.
Dr. Brian Davis, Professor, Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation.
The three of us are all biologists and hunters. Join us for discussions about game bird conservation and management and the science behind it. Of course, we'll also have conversations about bird dogs and bird hunting as well. This is Game Bird University. All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm super pumped about this particular episode for a myriad of reasons, but one, because it's going to be 100% duck focused. I've already been accused by Mark on some other episodes we recorded about figuring out as many ways that I can bring a duck reference into a conversation about a non-waterfowl game bird on some of these other episodes. So now we get to, Mark's not here, it's not going to be able to ruin our fun, and we're going to be able to talk nothing but ducks on this episode. So I'm excited about that, but I'm also excited for our guest that we have here today, a longtime friend and colleague of ours. Of course, we're in the first week of September, where we've got the first opening weekend of dove season behind us, and we're one step closer to the September teal season. So waterfowl hunting is starting to get on folks' minds here in the deep south, and this time of year in the waterfowl world, so it's really important that we wait for anxiously every year is to get that BPOP report, or that waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey report put out by the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's a super important report, along with other slew of status reports that come out around that mid to late August time frame. Really important in monitoring waterfowl populations, but also important in season structures and bag limits, along with other sources of data on that too. So really a cool report that's really important, that gets a lot of discussion this time of year, and it's just an integral part of how we manage waterfowl. And I knew we need to have somebody from deep in the duck factory come talk to us about that, have that discussion with us today. And I thought, who better than a Mississippi native that's now works in the heart of the duck factory. We've got Dr. Josh Vest, Fish and Wildlife Service, Prairie Pothole Region Joint Venture Science Coordinator. Welcome, Josh. We're so glad to have you on the podcast.
Hey, thanks, James. Really excited to be here and back here hanging out with the family from Mississippi State University again. So appreciate the opportunity today.
Good. Yeah, we've known. Well, Brian's known you longer than I have. Y'all overlapped here, I guess, at Mississippi State.
100 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've known you for a while. I think actually, oddly enough, the first time I met you wasn't at a conference or something. I think I met you when you were home for Christmas one time, and you were hunting at Knoxville Refuge. And I I think that's Josh Vest, and I went and introduced myself to you.
Yep, I think you're right, James. Yeah, it was there at the check-in shack there at Knoxville, getting ready for a draw for a waterfowl hunt one morning. So yeah, Dr. Davis and I, we go back quite a ways. I was an undergrad there at Mississippi State when Davis was working on his master's and his PhD, and I spent 2 field seasons working for Brian on his wood duck research. So yeah, great opportunity, great exposure, fun times.
Yeah. So kind of along those lines, Josh, just so give our audience a feel of some of your background, just kind of tell us real briefly, how did you come to waterfowl conservation, and how does a kid from West Point, Mississippi, find himself in Montana and in the Prairie Pothole region working for the ducks?
I wonder that same question a lot, James. Yeah, how did I wake up some morning? How did I get here? No, yeah. So you mentioned I'm originally from West Point, Mississippi, Clay County native. Grew up there on the banks of Tibby Creek, there in Clay County, where I kind of cut my teeth. I was really lucky growing up. My dad was an avid bird hunter, both quail and waterfowl, and I was tagging along with him and his hunting buddies as a little kid, long before I could carry a shotgun, and just spending time with them just left an indelible mark on me, and that kind of passion for the resource. Tagging along with my dad as a kid to Ducks Unlimited banquets, just allowed me that exposure to the great camaraderie and that conservation forward mindset that, we have here in the waterfowl hunting community. It really left an important mark on me. So anyway, through a series of random and fortunate events, that led me ultimately to the doorstep of Mississippi State University, just right down the road from West Point, there in Stark, Vegas, and got to introduce to the waterfowl professor there at that time, predecessor to Brian Davis here, Dr. Rick Kaminsky. Saw my passion for waterfowl hunting and for waterfowl, and took pity on me and took me on as an undergrad advisor. And yeah, from that, I got the opportunities to work for people like Brian on their research projects, and ultimately went on to do my master's research there at Mississippi State, working on waterfowl. And so yeah, I had a great foundation, very fortunate opportunities that not only Rick, but the other faculty and grad students there at Mississippi State University afforded me kind of that foundational exposure and putting me on a career path. So ultimately went on, migrated out west for my PhD, working on the Great Salt Lake, studying waterfowl ecology there. And once all that finally wrapped up, went and started a career working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in a program called the Joint Ventures. So I went to work originally for a group called the Intermountain West Joint Venture, working on wetland and bird habitat conservation in the West. And here for the past 4.5 years, I've been over in the Prairie Pothole Region, serving as science coordinator for the Prairie Pothole Joint Venture. So yeah, I've been really fortunate, really lucky. I can assure you I am more fortunate than I deserve. So glad to be here again today.
Well, awesome. I think we all kind of have similar stories of how we wound up, in waterfowl bouncing around. And the three of us all, very much tied to Rick, he's all three of our advisors at one time or another. So we owe Rick a great amount of gratitude for seeing something in us, whether we actually have that or not. He thought he saw something, so glad that he did. Whether he was spot on or totally off base, it helped us tremendously. So yeah, you mentioned joint ventures. I know a lot of folks that are enthusiasts of waterfowl hunting or waterfowl management. They may not be as familiar with the joint ventures and the roles like that you serve in, but it's a real integral part and been a real huge part of the North American plan and waterfowl conservation in general. And so if you give us just kind of a real quick brief synopsis of what the joint ventures are and kind of a little bit about your role. What is it that you wake up thinking about every day and doing every day?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll try to sum it up. I think joint ventures are one of the best kept secrets, I think, within the Fish and Wildlife Service. You hear the term joint ventures, and we're kind of in this world of wildlife conservation, wildlife management, right? You hear the term joint ventures, and you're like, what? This is talking about a hedge fund now? Unfortunately, we're not a hedge fund manager. I wish we were. We probably have a lot more money to work with for conservation and management. But the term joint ventures was kind of borrowed from the financial world. And as you referenced earlier, James, standing up with the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, that was really a bold, visionary, continental scale international collaboration to sustain healthy populations of waterfowl. And so one of the things that came out of that original plan back in the late 90s, if we're going to set the table for waterfowl populations at a continental level, we can't do it alone, and we can't really do it in a top-down kind of way, right? No single agency, whether it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or no single state agency, can really do all the work that needs to be done, or even like our NGOs like Ducks Unlimited. We can't do all that work alone and supply all that habitat and keep waterfowl populations healthy. And so the idea then was, well, we need this kind of regional scale coordination and collaboration frameworks to help push that work forward. And so these regional joint ventures were established originally in the early or the late 1980s. They stood up around 6 of these joint ventures, the most important breeding, wintering, and migrating areas across North America. The Prairie Pothole Region having 2 joint ventures because the Prairie Pothole Region straddles both Canada and the United States. We have one here on the U.S. side of the Prairie Pothole Region called Prairie Pothole Joint Venture, and a sister joint venture in Canada called the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture. So big picture, what these joint ventures are is they are essentially a program under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Migratory Bird Program, and they are charged with facilitating, coordination, and leveraging resources for bird habitat conservation. Early on, as we mentioned, under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, we've had a really heavy and strong focus on waterfowl ecology, waterfowl conservation, right? Each of these joint ventures are made up of a group of partners, made up of different federal agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service or U.S. Department of Agriculture, Natural Resource Conservation Service, or other entities, other federal agencies like the Bureau of Land Management or the U.S. Forest Service, depending on where you sit. It's also made up of other state agencies, our state fish and wildlife agencies, right? And a whole host of our non-governmental organizations interested in waterfowl and bird habitat conservation. Groups like Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, Delta Waterfowl, Audubon, the Nature Conservancy, or a whole host of different NGOs. And an interesting aspect, too, of these management boards is, increasingly we're seeing a private entity on these management boards. So either, a corporate representative, maybe somebody from the energy world, or often somebody from the agricultural representation as well. But for us here in the Prairie Pothole Joint Venture, we're fortunate to have a couple of grazing land coalitions and grassland coalitions representing our ranching industry here in the PPR, in the Prairie Pothole region, which is vitally important for our conservation work here. So anyway, these boards are kind of charged with overseeing, some degree of federal funds or federal support, but really helping to find ways to better coordinate and leverage resources to do the most important habitat conservation work we need to do in our given geography. So every one of our joint ventures are a little bit different, right? We're sitting in different geographies. For example, like there in Mississippi, we've got 3 joint ventures, right? We have the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture, the Gulf Coast Joint Venture, and the East Gulf Coastal Plain Joint Venture. They have kind of different parts of Mississippi, and they kind of focus on different parts of conservation there, right? And given what the population needs are during that annual life cycle for these birds. So our partnership may look a little bit different in the Prairie Pothole region than it does, say, in the Lower Mississippi Valley region. We're focused on wintering habitat conservation.
Awesome. Well, I've spent, most of my career and most of the capacity I have working with the joint ventures down here, Lower Miss mostly, and the East Gulf Coastal Plains. Mostly when I was a state agency waterfowl biologist, and a little bit with the Gulf Coast JV as well. But certainly, they're just a critical component of how we target our conservation for waterfowl and come up and set goals and objectives, whether that's habitat or populations or the people that, enjoy or pursue those birds, hunter numbers, whatever it is. So you kind of have those three different kind of objectives there with the North American plan, or the Naval plan.
That's a great point, James. Yeah, I think, so like part of the work that we do here in the joint ventures with our partners, and that includes university representation as well on a lot of our technical teams, is really trying to understand that kind of proverbial question of, well, how much habitat do we need? What do our conservation strategies look like to achieve that adequate amount and distribution of habitats, whether managed habitats or natural habitats? Do we need on the landscape to kind of set that table on an annual basis to support these populations of waterfowl or other priority birds? We spend a lot of time on the science side and that conservation planning side trying to identify, where are some of the best places for conservation investment, whether we're talking permanent protection or restoration or enhancement, right? All these different kind of conservation strategies and management needs, and putting that in a framework that then feeds back into what we're doing at the local scale, at a county level or a refuge level, how that fits into this bigger overarching, continental scale. So how these local scale actions manage this bigger continental picture.
Well, I know that so that does not, even someone who is knowledgeable about the joint ventures and the NAWAMP. I mean, even those of us who kind of know how it's set up, how it's supposed to work, that still seems like such a daunting thing to do. So I can only imagine folks that didn't, maybe don't know that we have folks out here doing this type of work, to thinking about how do you know, like, how much habitat do you need to support all of that, and that how do you go about figuring that out. So it is quite the undertaking, but I am sure I am glad there's folks like yourself that are probably smarter than me that they're helping figure that out.
That's hardly the case, I can assure you, James. Yeah. I think that is the interesting thing in the waterfowl management community, very early on under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, is really like setting this strong science foundation for conservation and for management, and really embracing that science wherever it takes us and wherever it leads us, right? But I think most importantly, what it set in the conservation world is this degree of accountability. We've kind of, as a broad international community, identified targets for what we want to accomplish. Now they are bold, and they are big, and they are daunting goals and targets to achieve, to be sure. We kind of put ourselves out there and hit some targets, and then challenged ourselves to now figure this out at a regional scale. How do we make all these puzzle pieces fit from the lower Miss or the Gulf Coast to the Prairie Pothole region? How do we make all this fit together to ensure we have the table set on an annual basis to help these birds? And that science foundation and a lot of the kind of behind the scenes stuff that most of our habitat managers and most of our stakeholders out there, our waterfowl hunting stakeholders, probably don't have a lot of exposure to, but there's a lot of work kind of going on behind the scenes to help ensure that we're accountable in how we're investing across our partnerships those resources for habitat conservation and management.
For sure. And to that point, I guess we can start talking about the one thing that I think most of our stakeholders do look at every year, which is that breeding population report. So, like I mentioned, how important it is, and we're always anxious, whether you're a waterfowl hunter or biologist or whoever, to see this come out every year. I'm a little less anxious now because I'm not a state duck biologist anymore, so it's not as anxiety-inducing, I guess I'll say. I'm just anxious to see the numbers. I don't have to think about, what does this mean for, recommendations for seasons and bag limits. Of course, back in those days, too, we were still on the waiting for the BPOC to come out to set that. Now we're a couple of years using previous year's data and such, so it's a little probably less anxiety-inducing for biologists now in that role. But back about a decade or so ago, I was pretty stressful at this time of year.
Absolutely. Yeah,
But,
it's a pretty anticipated time, right? And things are going to get busy when a report comes out. The phone starts ringing, and people have got questions. People want to know. People are excited. It's an exciting time of year right now for waterfowl hunters across the country.
For sure. And so this survey's been going on since the mid 1950s, and so very long data set. We're tracking waterfowl populations, and it's also the habitat. So give us that, how many birds show up to breed, and then how good is the quality of the habitat that in their nesting areas, give us an idea of how production might look like. Wetter the better. Hopefully better production, better brood survival, all those things. So I guess we can kind of start getting into this year's report. I know it's got some positives and it's got some to it as well. The positive being, it's the first time I think we've had an increase in total duck numbers from the previous year since 2015.
Yep.
I think. So almost a decade that we been going on the down each year, and so we finally got a little uptick. But we all know what last year's winter was like, and I can only imagine not a lot of snow melt and all those things as far as what breeding habitat conditions may have been this year. I know it got better maybe after the survey period in some areas. That might have helped out with some production, but just kind of let's just start talking about kind of overall trends, total ducks and habitat, and then maybe start getting into a little bit of some of the individual birds and what this might mean for us, and then we'll kind of circle back and talk a little more about really some of the drivers of what makes these numbers move the way it does.
Yeah, no, I think you had a really good read on it there, James. And I think I kind of characterized this year's breeding waterfowl survey report results as a mixed bag, right? I mean, the good news is we've seen a moderate increase this year over last year in the population overall in a primary area that we kind of are concerned about. I think here in the Prairie Pothole region, as well as for our stakeholders in Mississippi, we call the area of the waterfowl survey called the traditional survey area, which kind of covers the Prairie Pothole region, the Great Plains of the U.S. and Canada, up into the boreal forest, and then out to Alaska. So that survey has been going on, as you mentioned, since 1955. It's one of the longest at a broad landscape scale. It's one of the longest running and most comprehensive wildlife surveys in the world. I mean, I think most kind of lose sight of that. We've had the luxury of having this kind of information year in and year out for so long. We sometimes forget sight of this how visionary it was back in the late 1940s, early 1950s to establish this survey to give us an idea of what breeding populations look like on an annual basis, and the ability to maintain that survey over the past half century, right, to today. I think a lot of I think it just goes to say how important this information is to so many parts of waterfowl management, not just understanding and getting a kind of a lens on what's the breeding population look like. This information also feeds into like harvest management as well, right? So I think just pointing to how important this survey is, we've been really fortunate to have it, extending over such a long period of time. But the good news is we've got a little bit of bump this past year, about 5%. From 2023 this year in total ducks here in the traditional survey area. But the flip side of that is, as you mentioned, waterfowl populations have been declining for the past decade. We hit a high water mark in about 2015, and we've been on a pretty steady decline ever since then. So that's the upshot. We've seen a little bit of an increase this year. But I think kind of zooming back out and looking at a longer time period. A lot of us here in the waterfowl management conservation world, have some concerns about that longer scale trend, and what even next year may bring. This year too was pretty interesting, as you referenced, from the habitat conditions. Again, a real mixed bag. Habitat conditions across the Prairie Pothole region were mixed. Prairie Canada was really dry. Habitat conditions there very poor overall, and I think we're all anticipating lower production from Prairie Canada, going in from this breeding season. Coming down a little bit south into the U.S. side of the Prairie Pothole region, which covers, eastern North Dakota, eastern South Dakota, parts of Minnesota, Iowa, as well as out into Montana across the north central part of the state there. Overall, habitat conditions were good, particularly in South Dakota. Really wet this year in parts of South Dakota. I think we're anticipating good production this year, so a number of birds might recruit into the fall flight. What was interesting, I think, about a lot of the U.S. side and some of Prairie Canada too is we got a lot of rain or a lot of moisture kind of after or right as this waterfowl survey was wrapping up. And so I think what we're going to see here, at least on the U.S. side and maybe some parts of southern Canada, is that bump in moisture we got kind of late into the spring migration, early breeding season. It may have been a little bit too late to help some of those early nesters. A lot of those birds probably moved through the region. Maybe there's not much water in the landscape early on, except for places like South Dakota. The birds didn't settle there. They maybe moved on to more northern regions to look for breeding habitat. But the rain and moisture we got a little bit later, in the spring into early summer, helped recharge a lot of the wetlands that have been dry for the past couple of years. And I think what we're anticipating is for those birds that are going to be re-nesting or second nesters or second nest or third nest even, I think we're going to see pretty good habitat conditions for that and water carrying over from early spring or mid-spring into later in the summer, which is really important for brood survival, for those broods having habitat there. So we may have missed, may have not have settled with quite as many birds here in parts of the Prairie Pothole region, but at least in the southern part here on the U.S. side, I think we're anticipating a pretty good production year, or average, if you will, production year. But overall, I think we're kind of anticipating a lower recruitment from Prairie Canada, just given low numbers of wetlands and the dry conditions we're experiencing across much of that region. So having said that, and some of that kind of bears out from the report, we're kind of seeing lower numbers overall across the PPR, largely driven by Prairie Canada. We're seeing some bumps right further north, up into the Boreal, into Alaska, and some of the more northern regions. We're seeing some higher populations there from the report. So I think some of that kind of feeds into that overall kind of modest increase that we're seeing in that 5% bump in total duck populations. We're thinking about some of the important species to people and to waterfowl hunters and habitat managers there in Mississippi. Mallard populations, most of our mallards that are harvested and most of all our total ducks that are harvested in Mississippi come from the Prairie Pothole region, either from Canada or the U.S. The remainder of that kind of from the Great Lakes region and up into the eastern Canada and eastern boreal forest. But a vast majority of the birds that are harvested there in Mississippi come from the Prairie Pothole region. So what happens here, matters a lot, I think, to opportunities that waterfowl hunters and habitat managers are going to have here in the state this year. So thinking about mallards, pretty popular bird. Mallard numbers continue to be down. They're up overall, about 8% totally across the entire survey. But here in the Prairie Pothole region, we're still seeing a declining trend. We're down about, I think, 8%, I believe, or 16. We're off 16% from the long-term average. So going back from 1955 to current, we're still about 16% below that long-term average for mallard populations here in the PPR, which has historically been a really important area for recruiting birds back into Mississippi during winter.
Can I jump on that, James, a little bit?
Yeah, that's what I was going to let you go. I didn't want to hog all the questions here.
No, I was thinking back a couple of years or a couple of duck symposiums ago. It wasn't last one, it was in Manitoba. And I don't remember who the speaker was, but it seemed like generally breeding ducks were shifting to the east. Do I remember that correctly?
That certainly tracks with, I think, some of the trends we've experienced in waterfowl populations and even our pond counts. So if you look at pond counts this year, you look at Prairie Canada, they were down and then a kind of a declining trend. We were up on the U.S. side, up a little bit this year. So what we've seen, looking at some of the pond counts, when I say pond counts, so during the survey, as biologists are flying those surveys counting ducks, right, they're also counting the number of individual wetlands along those transects that they're flying in this survey. So we have an index of amount of available habitat or available wetlands on the landscape we call ponds. And what we've seen, I think this is a function of shifting trend as you move eastward into the Prairie Pothole region, particularly on the U.S. side. We've been getting a little wetter. We've been getting consistently more wet year in and year out here on the far eastern side of the PPR. And then as you move west, it becomes more of a mixed bag. You're getting somewhat drier. And in the Prairie Canada, you've been on a much stronger drying trend in a lot of that region than you have here on the U.S. side, where you've been seeing on the eastern side, like eastern Dakotas, Minnesota, and parts of northern Iowa. We've been kind of consistently getting wetter, right?
That was going to lead in, that kind of leads into my question, the reasons for that. And I kind of think about breeding ducks as almost like a matrix. It's water, either a lot of it or hardly any, and then vegetation type and structure, right? It's largely those two things, but we know water drives ducks, right? It might have been Johnny Lynch first said it, when you got a lot of water, ducks grow like weeds, and that's true. So I was wondering, we hear climate change 10 times a day, around the world and here in the U.S. and North America. And I guess my question was, it seems like the weather is really wonky, right? Now we've got tornadoes like all times of the year. You guys are getting tornadoes up there where historically they seemed pretty rare. We get these polar vortexes, things like that. So I guess I was wondering, not living up there and studying the weather patterns, have you all noticed like a real change? Like these places are becoming more wet and these places are becoming more dry. I mean, historically, as you go west to east, you'd move from the short grass prairie to the tall grass, right?
Right.
But I didn't know, like in the last couple of decades, if there's been a real marked change. Like, oh wow, man, this place is going to be dry for the foreseeable future. Or really, really wet over here. Has it changed a lot? Is it kind of moving around? And from a water standpoint, that could move ducks, but also you got the vegetation component too.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Brian. It's a matrix, right? It's the water and the grass, the upland and grass component. And I would say, yeah, painting with a broad brush, what we've noticed here and experienced are some of that, changing kind of environmental, kind of climate patterns, right? Where it's not only the total amount of precipitation, but also when it arrives now.
Right. Yep.
And so historically, all of these like millions of wetlands here in the Prairie Pothole Region, these prairie potholes, by and large, a lot of those wetlands filled in the spring based on snow melt from the winter, right?
Yep.
So they were charging for the wetlands were getting hydrated and charging as we had snow melt from the winter to the spring. What we've been, I think, experiencing, and every year is a little different, but looking back and zooming out and painting with a broad brush, we've been seeing a trend of now some of our wetlands our wetlands are getting filled now based on spring moisture and summer rain events, and particularly like how our fall was. And so the fall moisture going into the winter and setting that freeze conditions has a lot to do with carryover into the spring. But we're seeing on average a little bit less snow melt charging wetlands and an increasing amount of spring and summer rains now that are kind of driving some of that wetland hydrology now. So there's definitely some climate change components that are influencing those habitat dynamics here for sure.
Yeah.
And I think another interesting thing here too is like you just mentioned, water drives ducks, right? I mean, you look at all of our data, and wet years, we see growing populations of ducks, right? Birds respond to having a lot of water in the landscape, creating lots of opportunities for breeding. But and so at first glance, like, oh, well, things are getting wetter. Great, right? Fantastic. Well, wetter's not always better, right? As you know, and you've even taught me in some of my undergrad classes, Brian, about the importance of the wetland dynamics, right? These wetlands need to dry out periodically to be productive, right? They've got to dry out. So as we're getting wetter and more consistently wetter, the opportunity for those wetlands now to dry out and reset that plant succession and reset that functionality is going to decrease over time. So wetter is not necessarily better. It's probably like over the long term. Over the short term, it's probably great, but we consistently see this trend carrying forward over time. I think we're going to lose some of that functional productivity we have in some of these wetlands because they're not able to fluctuate and dry and wet over time.
So my follow-up to that, if I can, kind of shift into more of the vegetation components. And vegetation can be grass, parkland, and agriculture. So these shifts in the timing of wetness, how is that influencing farming operations, like in some of the key production areas?
Well, so that's a great lead-in. I'm gonna partially answer your question with a tie back to you mentioned a minute ago, kind of these shifting kind of climate dynamics we're seeing. What we're seeing here in the Prairie Pothole region is really synergy of climate impacts and land use change. So historically, the reason the Prairie Pothole region is so important for waterfowl populations is, as the end of the last ice age, when the glacier started retreating, it left behind these millions and millions of wetlands that evolved into this grassland wetland ecosystem, one of the most unique grassland wetland ecosystems in the world, which is absolutely perfect for ducks, right? They need the wetlands to find food, and they need the wetlands to raise their broods, but they need those uplands to nest in. Like most of our prairie nesting ducks, mallards, gadwall, northern shoveler, right, gadwall, they nest in uplands, but they require wetlands. So they're focused on settling based on the amount of wetlands on the landscape. But that upland grass or upland component is vital to maintaining nest success and getting that nest hatch and getting a bird down to a wetland. So what we're seeing now over the past couple of 2 to 3 decades, especially the last 2 decades, is this synergy of climate shifts and land use patterns. So as we're getting wetter and more humid, that is great for cropland expansion, particularly crops like corn and soybeans. And so we are seeing from that crop expansion, as well as some policies that have some national policies like the ethanol mandate. So when you put gas in your truck or gas in your car, right, 10% of that fuel is corn-based ethanol at a national scale. That's a national policy we have in place. And so those financial incentives, as well as changes in crop types and crop genetics, crop varieties, and a changing environment, right, that's more conducive for those types of crops, we're seeing a dramatic amount of grassland loss here in the Prairie Pothole region. Essentially, between the U.S. and Canada, since 2000, the past 2 decades, we have lost roughly 9 million acres of grasslands in the Prairie Pothole region, mainly from cropland conversion, or cropland intensification and cropland expansion.
I had no idea it was that much. Wow.
Yeah, so to give you some kind of context for what does 9 million acres look like? So take the size of the Mississippi Delta and double it. So that's how much grassland, like historic grassland, whether that could be things like CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, or native grass or pasture, like native rangelands that have been converted to cropland expansion. That's twice the size of the Mississippi Delta over the past 2 decades. Those are really, really spooky trends. And not just for the grassland loss, because what happens when you break that grassland out, you till it, well, you still got all those wetlands that are embedded in that crop field, right?
Yep.
And these farmers, they've got to they're wet, and they've got to drive around these things, and it hampers their efficiency to get crops in and out when they have all these wetlands in their field. And so once you break that grass out and you convert it to a crop field, the likelihood now of those wetlands in there being drained increases because it's impacting that farmer's efficiency to manage their crop.
Tile drains, things like that.
Yep, exactly. So we're seeing increasing rates of not just grassland loss or cropland expansion. We're also seeing increased rates of wetland drainage as well, and new technologies coming on all the time, right, to make even that more efficient. So, I think we've been talking, for quite a while about the crisis on the prairies here in our conservation community, and I think it kind of gets lost a little bit because we've had pretty good duck populations, for the past 20, 30 years. Duck populations have been doing pretty good, but we're, starting to see these increasing stressors on the landscape increasing at an increasing rate. We're now starting to see, declining duck populations over the past decade. And I think many of us here in this part of the world, looking at the trends that we're facing from that, cropland intensification, expansion, the habitat loss of wetlands and grass, I think some of us have some serious concerns that we're ever going to be able to reach those highs that we had like back a decade ago of waterfowl population. We just don't have the habitat base, and our conservation rates are, although we've been increasing, right, our partners are working really, really hard protecting wetlands, restoring wetlands, conserving grasslands, spending a lot of energy and being very successful with that. As we've become more successful at conserving habitats and managing habitats, that rate of loss has been increasing as well. And so the conveyor belt's just been speeding up along the same time. So I think many of us have got some substantial concerns that we'll never be able to kind of reach that population, high water mark that we saw a decade ago.
Yeah, 9 million acres. That I did not realize that. And I guess where I was thinking in terms of my question, you answered it. But what I was wondering is if it has gotten so wet later in the spring, if that's actually impaired farming acres because they can't get in the fields. But what you're saying is it's actually really the soil moisture now has really enhanced the opportunities for soybeans and corn and things like that. It's not so wet so late in the spring that they're impeded from getting there. It's almost an enhancement because of the moisture.
Right. Yep. We're seeing mineral conditions have, trended in favor, those types of crops now. I mean, we're actually now, if you go back and read the literature from like 20 years ago, and we are breaking out rangelands and habitat now that 20 years ago we didn't even worry about, because that's always going to be grass, right? The soil conditions, the soils are poor, they're not great for crops. Those habitats will always be there. We'll have grass and water for ducks and other birds in the future. Looking at that now, we're breaking those things out. 20 years ago, we thought we're pretty safe.
Yep. And that's one more follow-up, James, and I'll turn it back over. But I still use this slide in my classes, and if you've got any updates, it'd be great. But I remember 20 some odd years ago, the ethanol boom, right? Every grower up there, in the Missouri Coteau, it's the best of the best, right? And nobody farmed out because of all the boulders. And then during the ethanol corn switchgrass boom, somebody either at DU or Northern Prairie computed that for like every 1% native grassland loss, that equates to 20,000 fewer ducks in the fall flight. And man, I have no idea where that metric might be nowadays, but that was the one thing I'd wanted you to get to speak on too before we leave here today was like, what's the status of the Coteau, and that's where all the grassland easements with grazing lands, right? Exactly. Native prairie is the best, but bare dirt's the worst, and somewhere in between is grazing land. And having the Coteau and all those grazing opportunities all these years or decades have been fantastic. Next best thing, I guess, if you will. But then when you get, these ethanol booms and you've got financial incentives from the government to dig those up and put them into crops, man, that's another dagger for the ducks. So I don't know. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on where all that is and like where are the CRP programs and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. That speaks to. I'll touch on like the CRP piece of that first. And for our listeners, the CRP is the Conservation Reserve Program. It's a set-aside program for agricultural lands, croplands, and putting it back into grass. That program came online with the 1985 Farm Bill, I believe. And so, interestingly, like what we saw for prairie duck populations is after that, we started putting taking marginal cropland back out of production and putting it into grass, right? Well, in the early 90s, we started getting really wet again here in the prairies. And man, waterfowl populations exploded, right? And it really created like a system state shift for us for those kind of population dynamics here in the PPR. So through the early 1990s, we're seeing increasing grass on the landscape. We're seeing increasing water on the landscape. And this really continued. We had some dry years, some wet years in there between that. And for 20 years, right, we had quite a bit of grass on the landscape and quite a bit of water. Well, around 2007, I think, is really our high water mark for CRP. And that corresponds to what you referenced, Brian, with the ethanol mandate, right? So a financial incentive to grow more corn, and we put corn and soybeans into a crop rotation, right? And so those financial incentives have led to, a lot of that cropland expansion intensification that we're talking about. We've kind of already broken out all the really good soils, right? In Iowa and a lot of Minnesota, a lot of that had already been converted. And so now you're seeing that growth and that expansion occurring into those more marginal, soil areas like the Missouri Coteau that you're talking about. As you're marching, that intensification expansion is now marching westward, right across the Dakotas. And so it's starting to chip into and eat away at those more productive areas, some of our highest waterfowl densities, based on the amount of wetlands and the amount of available upland habitat, the grasslands around upland habitat around them. So we're seeing those financial incentives starting to eat into a habitat loss in those areas. And so we've lost 30. Oh, I just had this slide up earlier today. I can give you what that looks like for CRP. Yeah, since 2007, we've essentially lost 50% of the grass that we had on the landscape at that point in time, right, for CRP. So one of the things too, and you mentioned the different kind of management components. Well, here across the PPR, over 90% of this landscape is privately owned, and that all that land it's either being you know managed for cropland production, or it's being managed for grazing lands, beef cattle production or other grazing economies. And so we really have two stakeholders here in the Prairie Pothole region. We got farmers and we got ranchers. And fortunately for us, what's good for cows is good for ducks. Cows need grass and cows need water. Ducks need grass and ducks need water, right? So our conservation strategies are really strongly aligned with maintaining a very healthy and robust grazing economy within our partners, whether it's Ducks Unlimited, Fish and Wildlife Service, our state wildlife agencies. They work hand in glove with a lot of our ranchers, and ensuring that finding programs and incentives to make sure that their ranches are sustainable, that they're meeting their financial objectives, while at the same time providing all this great wildlife habitat, primarily a lot is for fowl. So those conservation strategies we have here are very well locked in step. But one of the big challenges we have is that there's a real disparity in the economics between raising a cow and growing crops. We have subsidy programs to the federal government that essentially, whether a producer gets a crop off or not, you have some guarantee of payment. Our ranchers, on the other hand, don't have a similar type of safety net, and so they're working on a much thinner profit margin than many of our crop producers are. And so we're seeing now, right? I mean, just penciling it out, we're seeing a lot of times these ranchers are looking at, just to keep their ranches intact, they're breaking out some of their ground now and putting it in crop production to ensure they're keeping a bigger chunk of their ranch intact. And so it's a real mixed bag, right? And it's really hard. I don't mean to say this in a way that vilifies our farmers on the landscape, because they're some of our most important conservation partners out there. Working hand in hand with them to find those win-win solutions for what works for them, just to keep those wetlands from being drained. That has tremendous value for waterfowl populations. Like as we mentioned earlier, ducks respond when things are wet and there's water in the landscape, whether those wetlands are farmed or whether they're still surrounded by grass. They still have value to ducks, because even if these wetlands that are in crop fields now, even if they're annually tilled or tilled every couple of years, you're still setting back succession and helping create habitat when we do have snow melt or rains that fill those wetlands. They're still providing food for waterfowl, for shorebirds, for birds that are not only nesting here in the Prairie Pothole region, but for those birds that are migrating through in the spring, right? They're stopping in these cropland wetlands and fueling up and migrating further north. So it's a very nuanced, I think, kind of a story there that we're seeing, some pressures here. We're working hand in glove with our ranchers, and we're continuing to find those win-win opportunities to work with our farmers to keep those wetlands from being drained on the landscape.
Yeah. Sorry, James.
No problem.
Sorry, man.
That's all great discussion, and I think
you got me on my soapbox.
no problem. That's what this is for getting up on that soapbox from time to time. Creates good discussion, but no. So I was, all of this that we've been talking about here recently, I think really should drive home, to our listeners that habitat, all the components in that matrix that Brian was talking about, the prairies are, the breeding grounds are, is important, but that grassland component is just as important, and there's threats to both of those, and changing climate on the wet side of things, and then also the changing in land use, and I think a lot of that probably is why for the last decade, a decade ago, 2015, 2014, I think that's like as good as good as we're ever going to get. Like, that's the best it's ever been since we've been doing the survey. Not much higher than that. I don't think you could realistically expect to go, but what it would take to get back to that, I think, is that getting that level of grassland habitat back on the landscape. And I don't remember, I don't remember who was it. Was it the last duck symposium? It was probably Ray had that figure where he had wasn't like the BPOP numbers, but it was just Lincoln estimates of duck
Yep.
populations. Followed similar trends, obviously, as the BPOP, just some different numbers. Those report a little higher, but that then he had with it, I think, CRP acres in the states, and it was pretty telling that when that starts dropping off, probably a little lag time before you start really seeing that response, but
Right.
pretty evident that losing just that way that grass is on the landscape. That's just one of many ways that you'd be losing grass, is if sort of coming out of CRP and going back into cropland. But then there's also other things, like you said, rangelands that are going into crop production and such too. So there's a lot more than just that, but just the CRP acre decline was pretty telling. When you looked at that figure of duck populations and just looking at that one parameter of CRP acres,
Yeah.
pretty obvious what's going on there,
Yeah, I can't underscore the importance the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, has had on continental duck populations here in the Prairie Pothole region. What's interesting too is, comparing Prairie Canada with the U.S. side of the Prairie Pothole region. So there's thinking about this region, it is, as Davis mentioned, one big matrix, right? And so historically, take away all the political boundaries across that map, and what has mattered historically over time for ducks is, well, not all the Prairie Pothole region is uniform. It doesn't uniformly get wet. It doesn't uniformly get dry. It's always this kind of mishmash of birds finding the right conditions in different parts of the Prairie Pothole region, right? Because we have millions of acres, millions of wetlands, millions of acres of wetlands across the region. And they're finding where those good pockets are. Some years, maybe it's in North Dakota, South Dakota. Maybe other years it's in central Saskatchewan or parts of Alberta. So it matters a lot. So we got to really think about our conservation approach, at that bigger kind of eco-regional scale. But getting down to the brass tacks of how we do management and how we do conservation, those programs we have, our opportunities are very, very different across the Canadian border and the U.S. side as well. So here on the U.S. side, we're very fortunate that we have programs under the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Farm Bill, things like the Conservation Reserve Program and programs like the Wetland Reserve Easement Program. We have the luxury of having these big federal national programs that are delivering millions and millions of dollars and millions of acres of conservation every year. We don't have that luxury in Prairie Canada. Their ag programs are more provincial, not federal, and so regulations and policies vary widely from province to province. And we also have the good fortune to having things like our duck stamp funds, right? So every time our duck hunters or waterfowl enthusiasts go out and buy a duck stamp, 90+% of that dollar is going directly back into purchasing habitat for waterfowl here on the U.S. side of the fence, right? So again, millions, tens of millions of dollars annually coming to help support waterfowl habitat here on the U.S. side. And we don't have the luxury of that same kind of programmatic development or the scale of that on the Canadian side. And what's interesting, if you start looking at the proportion of the population within the entire Prairie Pothole region across the U.S. and Canada, so back in the 1970s, roughly about 24%, low 20s% of the total duck population was breeding here on the U.S. side. You fast forward to the time period between the mid 1990s to now, and that number is getting closer to the low 30%, right? And so what we've seen is over time, a function of kind of changing climate conditions. We're getting a little wetter. but we also had a tremendous amount of conservation delivery and, maintaining quite a bit of good habitat landscape as well. Whereas in Prairie Canada, we continue to see substantial wetland loss rates, substantial grassland loss rates. And we've seen that kind of bear out in the population as well. We're seeing an increasing component, an increasing proportion of the population relying now on the U.S. side, which is much smaller than Prairie Canada. Prairie Canada has, way more wetlands and an overall total bigger population of ducks. But the densities we're seeing here in the U.S. side have been increasing over time, and we're becoming more important for maintaining that continental population than we were historically, reflecting of these changing landscape conditions, changing climate, and different policies we have.
One more. We got time, James. We may have to
Yeah.
wrap up, but thinking about Josh, this part of the world, as we've always joked, it's like we pretty much lost all the bottom on hardwood forest we're going to lose, right? Because everything that could be drained pretty much been drained, and everything's farmed. And then probably the last push was in the 70s when soybean prices really went up. Now you can look at this landscape and actually, I don't know what the number is, but I'm guessing we've actually accrued forested acres compared to 30 years ago because of farm bill programs. We got WRE and other plant restoration programs. But up there, so it's actually probably a positive trend here regarding forested stuff. But up there, talking about your 9 million acres, it's like, man, where can that go? I mean, could it become 18 and then 27 and 50 million, or the rate of change too across years? My God, that's spooky.
Well, yeah, that's the spooky part too. Is I think we all wish we had a crystal ball to look into the future with, right? And I guess our challenge right now is, at least in the short term, and I say short term, next decade, we don't anticipate any change or any decline in the rate of these pressures that we've been talking about. In fact, we're seeing some signals that the rates of loss we're experiencing may even continue to increase. We mentioned the corn ethanol mandate that's going into our cars and gas for our cars and trucks. Well, there are proposals right now in front being developed for Congress to have the same kind of thing for aviation fuel, right? So creating even higher demand for corn ethanol for corn production, right? So just the economics leading to that, it's a national policy. So yeah, it's like, where is the bottom? It's hard to say. It's hard to, I think what keeps us up at night the most is there are some things we can anticipate, and then there is the things that we can't anticipate, right? Those pressures and changes that just, 10 years from now, we're going to look back and like, oh, why didn't we think of this? Like something has changed. So I think that's the spooky thing for us right now, is not understanding, it's the known knowns, and then there's the unknown, like the unknown unknowns.
Yeah. I've got my fingers crossed that they come up with some better source of biofuel than corn for the aviation fuel. And whatever it is, that it doesn't grow in the Prairie Pothole region.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and not to be completely negative with this, I mean, I do think we are seeing some really important technological shifts, better using technology, right? Like precision agriculture. Farmers are doing, man, they've got it dialed. Like they know where the productive parts of their field are, and they know where it's not. And so they're leaning into that. I think there's going to be ag production. That's one hopeful piece. And I think we're also seeing an increasing trend right around soil health. I think regenerative agriculture is really starting to take hold. A lot of experimentation going on out there with cover crops. And so we still don't know what cover crops mean for duck production. It's still very early, right? The few studies we have out are kind of equivocal, right? I think it's going to take us a long time in doing a lot of different research and studies to kind of get an angle on a strong signal. But at the end of the day, soil health, regenerative agriculture, where we're keeping, more vegetation on the landscape through cover crops and finding ways within these crop systems that keep those wetlands from being drained. I think those are very exciting opportunities to help, stem some of that or counter some of the losses we're seeing and from cropland expansion and intensifications. There are some silver linings, and there are, I think, some hopeful glimmers out there that there's some important programs and policies that can be put into place that work not only for farming but work for ducks as well.
Good.
I think that precision ag or precision conservation in this case would be really, really awesome to see some conservation delivery in the prairies centered around that. We've had some of that. Mark McConnell has done a lot of work with that because farmers, those combines now, they got yield monitors in them. It's collecting that information. They're able to show a farmer where their portions of their field that aren't as productive and actually have programs they can run it through, and it has everything like current commodity prices and everything in there, and shows based on the CRP payment to do a field border or what have you.
Yep.
This portion in CP23 wetland practice, whatever it is, whatever practice you want, whether or not actually it may increase their profitability by not farming, because you're no longer putting those input prices, costs and everything into that acres that isn't performing as well, and kind of helping make it a financial decision. Because that's that speaks more volumes than it'd be good for the ducks. So.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And some of our conservation partners up here, they're really at the forefront of some of that work as well. So it's pretty exciting, and particularly in these landscapes we've already kind of lost a lot of wetlands. Finding those opportunities where finding those incentive programs that help things pencil out for the producer. That's the name of the game.
Perfect. Well, I guess we probably have been talking for long enough now. I don't want to get in the conversation because it's really good, and I know we could talk about it for the next couple of hours if we wanted to. But
yeah, I apologize, James.
No, great show. Great show.
I was just wondering. Did you want to talk any bit more about James, just some of the duck population stuff and the different habitat conditions, or did we get enough of that? I think one thing that we didn't hit on was the prairies are dry, but habitat conditions in other parts of the survey, Alaska, Boreal, the eastern Boreal were better, right? And I think birds are kind of moving around and they're finding they're going to where the habitats are, but. So I think that leads to a little bit of that 5% increase that we saw. So it's very different this year, where Prairie Canada's kind of down in habitat availability, going to be down in duck production. We think birds are kind of settled more into some of the Boreal and Alaska regions, which used to have a lot of wetlands, but those areas historically are not quite as productive or not as productive in producing birds. So kind of looking forward to this next year, we think we're going to have decent production here on the U.S. side of the Prairie Pothole region, and it's probably going to be down somewhat in Prairie Canada. And then we've got a lot of birds that are going to be breeding and nesting in kind of what we call, not as productive, habitat type years.
Well, that might be a whole nother, maybe there'll be another episode we could do, because I've had questions about that. We know there's really no replacement for the prairies, right? But if things become so bad, is the Boreal going to be the next greatest plan B? And
well,
on an per acre basis, it's much less productive. But when you add up the water across that landscape, there's a ton of it, right? So your density of breeding pairs are going to be pretty sparse, but there's a whole lot of water. So yeah, I don't know where that's all going to go in the future, but thankfully we still have that resource. But I know there's permafrost issues and exploration issues, and maybe that's a whole nother topic for another.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'd be fun. I'll just tease that with. We recently had that question posed to us. What's Plan B? Well, there is no Plan B. Yep. There's no place in the world that can do what the Prairie Pothole region does for duck populations, right? And so I think the future of waterfowl management, the future of waterfowl hunting opportunity is going to hinge on what happens in this landscape. So what happens here, I think matters to a lot of stakeholders across the country. And the challenge for us is this is flyover country, right? We don't have a large population base in the PPR. We don't get some of the national recognition and exposure in places like the Everglades or Chesapeake Bay or San Francisco Bay, where you've got
Yep.
millions of people sitting right there that are connected more directly to those wetland resources next to them. This is flyover country, right? Most people don't even think about North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, right? When it comes to the resources that they provide to them later in the year, right? So like our challenge is going to be making what happens here more relevant to a broader constituency of stakeholders beyond just duck hunters, right?
Well, definitely, we certainly can get that on the books for us to have a whole conversation dedicated to that here before too long. But I think the main thing that really folks can take home from this is that what's really important is that habitat component. That overshadows everything else. I'm sure we'll have conversations at some point about harvest and such. I know that gets a lot of attention, but any harvest effects are minuscule in comparison to having those habitat components in place and protected. And so that's the number one thing that's driving these bird populations, and so that's what we're focused on, and what folks like Josh are focused on. And I'm glad there's folks out there fighting that good fight, because obviously there's a fight to be had here.
A lot of work to be done, but I would also agree that partners are working very hard in this landscape and taking advantage of programs we have in place and building relationships with our farmers and ranchers every day to find those win-win opportunities. So yeah, a lot of good work yet to be done.
Good job, man. You guys the JVs are so critical. I mean, just all the partnerships and the entities and the private lands. I mean, no way we could do it without it.
No. It's an incredible part of the waterfowl conservation community, for sure. Yep. Well, fellas, this has been an awesome conversation.
Yeah,
Josh,
great job.
I can't thank you enough for agreeing to be on the show. I know I asked you back at the Duck Symposium, and I was going to hold you to it, so I appreciate you following through on it.
He didn't disappoint.
I appreciate the opportunity, James. This has been fun. Man, it's been great to catch up with old friends and walk down memory lane a little bit, but also talk about some of the great things going on here for duck populations, as well as some of the challenges that we face to remain here. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It's been a lot of fun.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Josh, and we're going to have you back on again soon, I'm sure.
All right. Hey, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Game Bird University Podcast. To keep up to date on when new episodes are dropped, or for more information on game birds and their management, you can follow us on Instagram at MSUEXT_GameBird, or follow us on Facebook at MSU Extension Game Bird Program.